Hi, this is Tim of the 1916 Company. We're starting the weekend right with watches. Batting leadoff, we have the latest generation of the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak self-winding. This is the 15500 in steel, launched for 2019. It is the current model, and you can see it has the highly desirable blue Grande Tapisserie dial. That is the large hobnail, but not the mega that you find on the offshore. So you can still have those tens of thousands of tiny details cut by a traditional pantograph mimicry engine. As always on a Royal Oak, a big part of what you pay for is the finishing of the case. Now this one's wonderfully intact. Everything remaining full and distinct. The break between polished and satin super sharp. It takes between 9 and 11 hours to finish these bracelets, and that's just the bracelet, not the bezel, not the case. And you can see that the time was well spent. Vertical satination on the flanks. You can see that we have integration of case into lugs into bracelet with a taper down towards the clasp. There is a little shoulder bevel that runs down the shoulders of the links, and then you can see the intermediate links, or the plots. They're actually polished on their inner faces. Every single one of them polished on both sides. Incredible attention to detail. And then with satination and media blast inside the clasp. It's a robust clasp. You can see the gauge of the steel used is quite substantial, and when closed, it is a sequential close. It has the robustness of an offshore. Now, of course, full disclosure, pre-owned watch, there are some small marks of wear demonstrating that this watch has been enjoyed. And that's exactly how I would recommend you use it. Enjoy it. This is a watch that is more durable than a jumbo, more substantial than a jumbo, technically a little bit more capable than a jumbo. One important feature being the screw-down crown. While both this and the jumbo are rated 50 meters, the fact that this has a screw-down crown means this is a surface swimmable watch. Turn out the lights, you can see no shortage of luminescence. When Gerald Genta created the first Royal Oak in 1972, fancying himself a jewelry designer first and foremost, he envisioned a bracelet that just happened to have a watch attached, and that's exactly how the design was executed. To this day, handsome, probably created perfect from the beginning. It's varied in scale and detail, but the fundamental rounded octagonal bezel and integrated bracelet and case has been continuous. Now that bezel was originally inspired by a vintage diving helmet, and you can see that since the beginning we have had white gold bolts, and they are bolts, they're not screws. That's how they can align the way they do. They are white gold, so you can see that they're a little bit different. They're warmer in tone than the steel of the bezel itself. Flip it all over, we have the latest generation Audemars Piguet manufacturer. Automatic caliber, 32 millimeters in diameter. This is the 4302, 70-hour power reserve, hacking, quickset, big, fills the case back. And you can see that to good effect. The prior 3120 movement was only about 26 millimeters. This one is a better match for a 41 millimeter case. You see you have a full dual anchored balance bridge with a free sprung balance compared to the previous movement. The power reserve is up 10 hours to 70, and the beat rate is up from 3 to 4 hertz. You can also see that the rotor is quite impressively finished. It's the single most manually executed element of this movement's finish. So you see how it's been skeletonized internally, and then there are many, many, many sharp internal creases where bevels meet. That's something I always applaud. Look at the subtlety of that rounded octagonal center to the rotor, another nod to the Royal Oak's most famous design trait. We have polishing, satination, and then beveling on this rotor. It's a work of art in its own right. Let's throw it on my wrist. This is a large watch, I'm not gonna lie. Well, it's only about 10.9 millimeters thick. It is about 56 millimeters from link to link across the wrist, so it's substantial. I recommend it for a wrist, I would say 15 centimeters circumference and up, assuming your wrist is flat across the top like mine. Once again, for reference, my wrist is 16 centimeters circumference. But if you want something that's just as fine, a little bit more compact, and frankly, a lot less dear in terms of cost, the current generation Breguet is the way to go. Breguet Marine. Now, this generation launched in 2018. This is a 40 millimeter titanium watch. It's 11.7 millimeters thick, and you can see the case with a double domed bezel, coined case flank. We do here have a screw down crown. The watch is 100 meters water resistant. The dial with the sun ray originating at the logo. You can see it's a unique kind of off-centered sunburst. This is a dial cut on a rose lathe, traditional guilloche, and then crafted from solid gold. We have applique white gold Roman numerals. We have a lovely sort of nautical pennant as the counterweight to the second's hand, and modified Breguet hands, because this watch is loomed. You can see no shortage of it in the dark. It's actually quite more elaborately luminescent than the Royal Oak and easier to read at a glance. Also worth mentioning, this is grade 5 titanium, so it's a much lighter and hypoallergenic watch. The bracelet is nicely made. You can see it has a hinge profile with these large extended lugs. It is fairly broad across the wrist at the edges of the extended link, so it's going to be about 55 millimeters from side to side, but you'll see when I put it on my wrist that it doesn't wear anything like a 55 millimeter broad watch, and I'll demonstrate that to good effect. That's because there's a little bit of an inherent downward angle in those end links, and you can see how well it wears. I would recommend this watch for a wrist of 14 centimeters circumference. Every capability you want, from scratch resistance with grade 5 tie to water resistance, shock resistance, luminescence, and of course automatic winding. This is kind of the thinking man's integrated bracelet sports watch, because there's really no hype trailing it on social media or clouding the judgment of its aftermarket pricing, meaning that the price you pay is a very fair one for this model. Now you can see on the back we have caliber 777A, free sprung, and with a 55-hour power reserve. You see it as a ship's wheel as the rotor, reminding you that Breguet was once the watchmaker to the French Navy. In addition to a free-sprung architecture for greater shock resistance and precise adjustment, this movement features a silicon escapement and a silicon hairspring, reducing the need for lubrication and substantially improving the anti-magnetic qualities. A lot of hand finishing here. The rotor is beautifully decorated by manual means, including polishing of those spokes. And then you can see that there's beveling on the bridges. The stripes across the bridges are not Côte de Genève. They're designed to evoke the teak deck of a vintage naval vessel. And then we have a spectacular solarization on the barrel cover with a high grade of engine turning on the base plate. And also on the lower planes of some of the bridges, like the barrel bridge, you can see the click spring right there with a engine turning underneath and black polished screw heads. All of this quite impressively rendered, really handsome, artisanal, and technically capable. Lots to love with this latest generation Breguet Marine 5517T. Now we're going to stick with bracelets. Back in 2003, Ulysse Nardin launched what must be one of the best values in complicated watchmaking. This is the Marine Annual Calendar Chronograph. Now, it is a chronograph that uses a Dubois de Praz vertical clutch annual calendar module, very, very similar to the Richard Mille RM11. The only thing the RM11 version has that this does not is flyback capability, but we do have the double-digit date, the chronograph, and it is an annual calendar. Since we have the date and the month, this only needs to be reset once per year during the jump from February to March. Tachymeter scale outboard, you can see this is dial, all of blue on white for a nice high contrast. It has the Ulysse Nardin Marine profile with the coined bezel, the individual number plate on the side with fired blued screws. We have some of the dial features of the old Ulysse Nardin deck chronometers or navigation clocks, the marine chronometers, which lend this model line its name. And you can see no shortage of luminescence on the dial, including sub-registers. 100 meters water resistant. On the case back of this 40 millimeter watch, you can see a number of gold medals historically won by Ulysse Nardin timepieces, and a really impressive piece. 100 meters water resistant, 40 millimeters in steel, automatic winding, annual calendar, and a chronograph. Just about any wrist can wear and enjoy this watch. Look how far inboard of the edge of my wrist those lugs are. This watch is a little marvel and a gem. It could easily be your only watch, but if you want utmost value and a brand that is now once again independent and very cool, Ulysse Nardin is a brand on the rise that I happen to admire greatly. And while I don't love everything from the era in which the company was heavily dependent on Eastern European markets, this largely predates that era, which is why it looks so timeless. It looks like something that could be launched today. This is a fantastic value and complication from a really cool brand. Now we'll go much larger here. You may not think that an IWC Pilot's Watch Timezoner has anything to do with independent horology, but in fact it does. This model, which launched in 2016, is a flyback chronograph with a sort of modified world time complication, originally designed by Andreas Streller for Vogard watches. And Vogard had its own version of the Timezoner chrono, later sold the patent to IWC to be used in the Pilot's Watch collection. So we have a 24-hour hand and a 12-hour hand, and they're mechanically linked together. And so I can move this bezel and change my reference city, and as I do so, I get a different reading of the time in both 12 and 24-hour formats. The bezel has a ceramic cap. We do have a flyback chronograph, IWC manufactured caliber, with column wheel actuation, and as you can see, it is a column wheel with a vertical clutch, 68 hours of power reserve. There is a stop seconds function, 5-position adjustment, and all of the adjustment is done using the bezel. When you want to adjust the time zone, we actually have superimposed chrono hour and minute hands at the top of the dial, so you actually get both of them. The watch has a screw-down crown and a 60-meter water resistance, which means game on, thumbs up for surface swimming with this watch, and no shortage of luminescence. We have a Dornier tri-motor on the back, a aircraft owned and operated by IWC, which wants you to remember it is a Pilot's Watch company. We'll throw this watch on the wrist and you will see that it is large at 45 millimeters. It's a watch that I recommend, frankly, for wrists a little bit larger than mine. At 45 with a broad wingspan, appropriate for a Pilot's Watch, you can see that this thing is rather prominent. And I would recommend your wrist be at least 17 centimeters circumference to wear this. But if you're the type who likes complications, you like the Andreas Streller connection, which I certainly do, and you travel a lot or use chronographs, what a handsome watch with a fantastic combination of very practical complications. Now, from a beast to a watch that is not a beast in the least, this is the Cartier Series CPCP Collection Privé Cartier Paris. Is a high horology line made from 1998 to 2008, and they used high-end movements from across the world of watchmaking in timepieces that recalled the greatest classical Cartier designs. And this is the CPCP Tank à Vis, and it is one of several Tank à Vis models. This one actually features a unique date complication that drives bidirectionally with a rosette guilloche and then a scrolling or wandering hours display in 24-hour format. Take a quick look. This is how the watch tells the time. You have a 24-hour format scrolling hour up at the top, and then at the bottom you have a date. Now, what I find fascinating here is that, and I will use my other hand, we actually have something I've never seen on any other Cartier watch, which is a bidirectional quickset mechanism. The scrolling hour display and the bidirectional quickset are Cartier's complications in this Tank à Vis. And on the reverse side, we see a movement that may not look familiar at first glance because it's been heavily modified in shape, texture, tone, finish, and even bridge architecture. But if you look just at the location of the crown wheel, the ratchet wheel, and the drivetrain pivot jewels, you can see that this Cartier 9902 MC started life as a Piaget 430. And the Piaget 430 is very thin, fine, high horology, but also round, with big mono bridges, not these lovely vintage evocative finger-style bridges and a fully visible train down to the escapement. All of these bridges are custom cut for the Cartier application. And then we have a level of finishing that's even a little bit more accomplished than what you'll find on the Piaget. Cartier uses its own rack and pinion style micrometric adjustment mechanism with a blued Cartier C. These individual bridges that feature a Cartier monogram on their top. And then, I'll do my best to show this, but the edges of the bridges really are mirrored and quite attractively. With polished screws, we have a polished cover to the keyless works mechanism and a lovely solarization on the ratchet wheel. These CPCP Cartier watches are incredibly collectible. They're also beautifully sized, as this is only 40.5 millimeters lug to lug and 27.5 millimeters across, not inclusive of the crown. The tank à vis, powered by a extensively Cartier-modified Piaget base with Cartier's own mechanical complication movement. Super special, easy to wear. There's a lovely nubuck alligator leather strap. Nubuck meaning it's been sanded down to remove the imperfections at the top of the hide, giving it a velvety feel. And the watch is quite thin. You can see the strap is unbroken in, so it's very stiff here, but the watch is compact and will wear on the wrist of a man or a lady. This is Cartier watchmaking at its absolute finest. It's the Cartier of your dreams, the Cartier that lives up to the legend. So highly recommended on that front. Now, if you want something that is a legend in its own right, but maybe a little bit more sporting, 100 pieces only for 2013, one of the rarest and most desirable modern Zenith models. This is the El Primero Lightweight. Now, there were two series of El Primero Lightweight. This is the more sophisticated of the two with the striking 10th system. We have a case that is externally composed of carbon fiber. Internally, the canister that actually holds the movement and the dial is made of titanium, sapphire front, sapphire back, and this unique caliber 4052 is made of titanium. So it doesn't just look like it might be tie, it actually is. 100 pieces, 100 meters water resistant. We have a strap of rubber and Codura designed to go the distance, a titanium clasp that has been DLC blackened, and though the watch is 45 millimeters in diameter, it is feather light on the wrist, and you could see that to good effect. Now, I can wear this just fine, but I believe just proportionally, not in terms of weight or fit, but proportionally, your wrist should be my size or larger if you want to wear this. So 16 centimeters circumference and up. The El Primero caliber used here, the 4052, features the striking 10th. So what it does is it has a foudroyant that runs around the dial once every 10 seconds. Every El Primero since the original in 1969, with the exception of the Rolex calibers, has been able to resolve 1/10 of a second. The problem is always that 1/10 of a second on a regular chrono scale can be impossible to read. So by spreading 10 seconds over 360 degrees, it becomes quite easy to read the tenths. Now you can see that this is 1.4 seconds. Very easy to see and visually spectacular. You have a running 60 seconds display. You have a 60-minute chrono register, the classic overlapping tritone that's been a feature of El Primeros since 1969. We have a radial disc that actually indicates the date, and as with most El Primeros, it's a bit of a quirky thing. Setting in the crown's intermediate position. And then when you roll the wheel all the way out, the crown out to maximum extension, that activates the quick set. Still 10 beats per second, 50-hour power reserve, column wheel, lateral clutch. You could see the column wheel, and you could see the lateral clutch. But if you look carefully, you can see that the lateral clutch's primary driving wheel is actually 100 teeth and made of silicon. And that is what accelerates the operation of the chronograph. So the larger that wheel right there, the faster the chronograph drives. So you can see that there's a little tiny pinion that drives off the escape wheel itself, and then you have two different levels of teeth for that intermediate driving wheel. There's the one that interacts with the little oscillating pinion type thing right there, and then you've got one that interacts with the intermediate driving wheel, or I should say the wheel on the clutch. So pardon me, this is a fixed pinion. It's not an oscillating pinion, it's a fixed pinion. That's your lateral clutch primary driver right there. Really good looking and super lightweight. An absolute epic and one of Zenith's best of the modern era. Now, this is a watch that exhausts superlatives. Back in 2004, FP Journe created a watch for the anniversary of the auction house Antiquorum, and it used a time display he'd created for a private client in the 90s and a base movement he had created for a Cartier Tour 2 that never happened. Journe was asked to create an auction watch that was unique for the auction, and with precious little time to develop an all-new model and movement, he combined those two things, the display complication and the base caliber, and he created the Vagabondage with a movement that shows the oscillator on the dial side and a wandering hours complication used by, among others, Breguet and Audemars Piguet during the 1920s. So the hour represents the current hour, and then it gets locked into place above the hours disc and wanders like a vagabond across the dial, indicating the time. So right now, you are looking at 4:40. That's how this works. And as it approaches the top of the dial, it hands off to the succeeding hour. Now, this is not one of the original examples from the early 2000s. This is actually the 2022 re-release, of which 69 pieces were made, or pardon me, 68 pieces were made in rose gold. The original Vagabondage was made in 3 pieces for the auction, yellow, rose, and white gold, and then 69 pieces in platinum, including 10 that were gem set. But there was no regular production rose gold version of the Vagabondage 1 until 2022, when Journe finally built the 68-piece rose gold Vagabondage 1 so that people who owned the original ideally would be able to get the same serial number, now in rose gold, to complete the set. So we have a peripheral dial of rose gold with 4 black polished steel brackets, piano key style minutes display, tonneau case without the maker's mark on the dial, no name, no unvenet et fecit. That is a long-running tradition with the Vagabondage. Now, it is a 37.5 millimeters wide without the crown. It's 45.2 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, and it is 7.9 millimeters thick. So it's a fairly compact watch, though it is larger than the original. When you turn it over, you can see we've got the caliber 1504 here, and it's made of solid gold. You can see it's got 2 barrels. All the bridges and plates are gold. We have stripes. We have beveling, we have polishing on the click spring and solarization on the crown wheel adjacent. It is a beautiful movement, properly sized and shaped to fit the case. And then the watch comes with something that is not common on Journe watches, which is a full clasp. On the wrist, it wears almost like a second skin because it is so compact in terms of its thinness and short across the wrist. A very special watch. In terms of its ergonomics, it fits me easily and could be appropriate on a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters circumference. So, as you can see, very flat and also not very broad across the wrist. I've got plenty of clearance here. Finally, a watch that is simply a monster, launched in 2021. This is the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Offshore self-winding tourbillon chronograph, a very cool combination of grade 5 titanium and several unusual finishes for a Royal Oak Offshore, with a caliber 2967 that features a flying 1-minute free-sprung tourbillon that does include an overcoil. We have a chronograph complication. We also have a tachymeter scale, substantial water resistance, a little bit of lume, and then you can see on the reverse side a limited edition of 100 pieces automatic winding, something rarely seen on Audemars Piguet tourbillon chronograph watches, which generally use an older caliber developed during the 1990s. And this being an automatic is a much more durable and daily wearable movement. So 65 hours of power reserve via rotor winding. You have 100 meters of water resistance. You have a combination of a crisp column wheel actuation. And then if you look at the tourbillon itself, easily the best finished part of the watch, there is also flyback chronograph capability. So you've got the crispness of the column wheel and the unique flyback complication, which allows you to reset and restart the chrono without first stopping. And you do get all of the fun on the dial side, as that tourbillon carriage has been beautifully polished, satinated, and beveled on its tiny componentry. The dial open airy forward-looking, technologically suggestive, a really cool-looking watch that puts all the action on the dial side. Well, the case back is attractive and handsomely decorated. Make no mistake, all of the action here is on the dial side of the watch. And it fits easily on my wrist. In spite of being a large timepiece, about 44.5 millimeters in diameter, I have no problem wearing this, partially because the lugs turn down so dramatically on the wrist. It's very comfortable. It will fit underneath a jacket cuff, if not the tightest of dress sleeves. And I can recommend this watch for a wrist my size or larger. Now, in terms of those finishes I mentioned earlier, unusual application. You can see we have a combination of both polish and satination on the ceramic components, which include the chronograph pushers and the crown shoulder. It is a screw-down crown, by the way. Then you can see that the hoods of the lugs, the flank of the case, and the top of the bezel, they're actually very finely matte finished, a very fine, non-granular media blast to give it sort of a pale, dull sheen that contrasts nicely with the polished steel bezel bolts. And if you look, the bezel is irregularly shaped. It thins and dips at 6 o'clock and at 12 o'clock, and it actually thickens and rises at 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So there's a surprising amount of nuance in the design of this watch. You can also see it uses a quick release system. You press these two buttons, the strap pipes right off. And not only can you pop the strap off with those little push release, but you also have a system that is built into the clasp where you simply turn this little dial, this little switch right here, and the clasp pops off the strap. So it makes sense that you have a quick release, tool-free for the strap to remove itself from the case, but then you also have a quick release built into the titanium clasp that allows you to remove it so you can strap swap without needing any tools whatsoever. If you love the watches you see right here, email us. My email, our email, is tmosso@the1916company.com.